Well, thank you. I was just visiting with Chad a second ago, and he came in from Wisconsin, and we were talking about his business, and he's a painter, and I was about to tell him that there was a Benjamin Moore ship that was coming in from Mexico with raw paint coming into Galveston last week. I don't know if you heard that on the news. It ran aground, and the ship was carrying nothing but black paint and red paint to the factory for them to mix. And it ran aground, and it was on an island there near Galveston, and last I heard last night, the whole crew was marooned.
We walked right into that one.
I appreciate that, Joe.
I just hope this thing edits.
I'll use that.
Well, I just want to thank Clyde for the opportunity to be here and do this, and to get to meet so many of you. I've really enjoyed everyone I've met so far. It's been a thrill. And it's amazing to find a group of people who are on the same page. Like Clyde was saying, we have a Bible study near my place of fellow heretics, and both of us meet every once a month. It's a thrill to get to be with others like myself. And I love Pennsylvania, and to come up here is always a highlight. It's just such a beautiful place. And I used to come up here every summer growing up from Dallas. My mom grew up in Rochester in the Beaver County area, just north of here. And actually it's more west of here, I guess. And we would come up and spend time with my grandmother and my aunts and uncles and cousins, and did that every summer. And it was such a beautiful sight to ride the train from Dallas through all of the states between here and there, and it was so neat to come into the Ohio River in that train, especially at night, because this is back in the 60s when Jones and Laughlin steel mills, 17 miles of steel mills line the Ohio River. Wow. And those mills ran 24/7, of course, and so at night they lit up the sky. And what a thrill it was to look out of that train window and see those beautiful red sky over the river for 16, 17 miles. And it's all gone now. It went to Japan. But it was always a real thrill to come up here. In fact, I called one of my aunts the other day to tell her that I was going to be up and I'll come by and visit her tomorrow afternoon. And she lives on a farm north of Rochester, and she has Amish neighbors. And she told me that Amy Yoder had called her the other day, one of the ladies I met when I was up there last. And she's leaving her husband, which I was shocked. I didn't know Amish people ever did that. And I said, why? And she said, well, he's been driving her buggy.
We're ready for you then.
No more, I promise. Well, like I say, I grew up in Dallas, and I met my wife when I was a sophomore in high school. We got married the last week of our senior year in high school. We along with two other couples, actually got our diplomas as married couples. And we had our first daughter 4 years later, and from 1977 until 1991 we had 5 children. Our 5th child, Colson, which by the way, we hand me that file folder right underneath the iPad there. I've got some pictures here to share with y'all too. But when Susan was pregnant with our 5th child, we were thinking of a name, of course, like any young couple does for the child. And I was driving home from a construction site. I'm in the construction business, and I remember it was a real hot June day, and I was in my van with no air conditioning and listening to fellow Dr. Dobson's Focus on the Family. And he had a guest on that day who had just gotten out of prison. And in 1973, those of you who are old enough to know there used to be a president named Nixon, and he was convicted, and his staff went to prison. And one of those men that went to prison was his chief of staff, Chuck Colson. And he was interviewing Chuck Colson, and he told the story about how he was an atheist the entire time he was in the White House. And when he was in prison, he had been approached by people trying to give him the gospel message, and he rejected it. And somebody got him to thinking about the fact that he had just gone through a conspiracy, and this conspiracy fell apart, and everybody involved in this conspiracy got in trouble, and he started thinking about this idea of the conspiracy of these disciples lying about a man that got up and walked. And as he thought about that, he realized, knowing that those men were arrested, they were imprisoned, they could have denied Christ and been freed. And he started thinking, people don't lie to get into trouble. People lie to get out of trouble. Pretty simple. And then he realized too that you can't keep a conspiracy together. It will always fall apart. Somebody will lie or somebody will confess, and it will crumble. But none of the disciples ever denied Christ. When he realized that, he realized the gospel was true. There really was a man named Jesus Christ who was resurrected. So when I got home, I told Susan the story, and I said, I think we ought to name our next baby Colson if we have a boy. And sure enough, we did have a boy, and we named him Colson. And we lived in McKinney, Texas, which is north of Dallas. Like I say, I was in the construction business, and by around 2001, 2002, we had decided to look for some land. 4 of our children were already grown and gone, and it was just Colson at home with us. And we bought a farmhouse that was about 45 minutes north of Dallas. It was out in the country, 20 acres. And we moved in. We were there for about 2 years, and I was working on getting my pilot's license. And one evening in May of 2006, I went to the airport and got up on the plane with my instructor for doing some night flying. And as we got up about 3,000 or 4,000 feet, I looked out to the west, and there was a storm. And my first thought was, I don't like weather. I'm a chicken pilot. I don't like to be up when anything's going to be crazy. So I said, let's just go ahead and land. And he said, I agree. So we landed, and I drove home. I got home about 9:30, fixed a sandwich. At the house that night, my daughter was gone at work. Her son, Parker, who is 2.5 years old, my grandson, was there. My wife Susan and myself, our son Colson, who was 14 at the time, and our nephew was with us, staying with us. He's 14 also, so Colson's cousin was there, and they were playing video games. I was getting ready for bed, and it was dark outside, and it started raining real hard. So I figured, well, the storm's come, and we're going to get some rain, welcome rain. And it lasted about 10 minutes, and it was over. And I thought, oh, wow, that was quick. Well, about 15 minutes went by, and a friend of ours called, and she was almost yelling. And she said, there's a tornado coming at your house. And right when she said that to Susan, the house went pitch dark, the phone went dead, and Susan screamed and said, "There's a tornado coming," and I grabbed my grandson, Parker, and she took the two boys, and they went under the staircase. There's a big 2-story Victorian house. They went into the staircase and huddled in there, and I took Parker into the washer-dryer room and laid him on the floor and laid on top of him, right next to the washer and the dryer. Well, the very moment that we got into position, we heard crashing and a freight train, and instantly every window in the house broke. The front door flew open. It was a big, big door. I heard it whiz by. It shot through the hallway, went out the back of the house. And then I felt the entire house lift up off the foundation, and it was turning. It was just shifting. And then it dropped. And when it dropped, the upstairs crashed down on top of us. The staircase where Susan and Colson and my nephew Robert were was pushed down through the floor. The house was a pier and beam house that was about 4 feet high. Pushed the staircase down through and pinned Susan on the ground underneath the staircase. And Robert, my nephew, who was on one side of Susan, it sucked him outside, and he landed on his feet without a scratch. While debris was flying around him in the dark, he could hear things flying by him. And then the upstairs rooms over where the washer and dryer were crushed the washer and dryer down to about this tall.
Oh my gosh.
And I was laying on top of Parker, and the sound was tremendous, but it only lasted about 7 or 8 seconds, and then it was over. And all I could hear was a broken water line and some kittens. And evidently our cat had kittens under the house, and then I heard Susan yell, "Are you okay?" And I yelled back at her, fairly distant from her. I said, "Yeah, I'm fine." And I was grabbing Parker, and he was crying. He's only 2.5 years old. And being that it was so dark, and I was barefoot. I had my jeans on, no shirt. I was getting ready to go to bed. And I slid out of that little triangle that I was trapped next to the washer and dryer, and I reached in and pulled him out, and as soon as I got him in my arms, I felt nothing but nails everywhere I was touching. And within 5 or 6 seconds, it got bright as you can imagine. And all of those storm clouds had just disappeared. As fast as they came, they were gone. And it happened to be a full moon that night. And my first thought was, where am I? Because all our trees were gone. We lost over 1,000 trees. And all the trees that were behind the house were gone. And I couldn't figure out where we were. And I was holding on to Parker, and I could see my pickup truck, which wasn't where I'd left it. And I could see the nails on the boards, and I managed to make it to my truck and put him in the truck, and then went back to see if I could help Susan and find the boys. And to my surprise, Robert walks up next to me, and he said he was fine, he wasn't injured at all. And we made it over to the staircase where Susan was, and she said that she was fine, just try to find Colson. So Robert and I yelled for him. We walked all around the house, through the debris, tried to lift things. I remember trying to lift wall panels. It was amazing how heavy everything was, you know, and we just couldn't move anything. And we weren't hearing a word. And after about 10 or 15 minutes of the search, I went to my truck and got out my pistol. We're in Texas, by the way. Got out my pistol and shot it in the air because I could see fire trucks at our neighbor's property about a half a mile away, thinking that maybe somebody would we can get their attention. Well, I don't think it got anybody's attention, but one of my neighbors, who was a Plano firefighter, was out driving around looking at the debris, and he saw my gate was open, so he pulled in, and he saw me out in the driveway, and asked if everything was okay, and I said, well, I can't find Colson, and he saw that the house was completely destroyed and the trees were gone. So he called in for backup right away, and within about 15 minutes we had a state trooper there and some volunteer firemen showed up, and they began their search. And the state trooper wouldn't let me or Susan go near the house. He kept us away from the house while they worked for their search. And for the next 2 hours, family members and friends began to show up, and we were prepared for the worst. I mean, we weren't seeing anything or hearing anything of Colson. And I remember it was about 1:30 in the morning, and two of the volunteer firemen and a sheriff's deputy and one of the policemen, the four of them came over to us, and they had their arms wrapped around each other, and they looked at me and Susan and they said, well, we found Colson. And he's not alive. And one of them told me, he said, well, he didn't suffer. He was hit in the back with a beam from upstairs and probably knocked his breath out right away. And said he didn't have any physical injuries. He physically looked fine, but he had the breath knocked out of him. And by this time, there were probably 25 pickup trucks in our driveway and scattered around, and friends were there. And for the next 2 hours, we waited for the funeral home people to show up, and not one single person would leave our property until Colson's body was removed. And I remember about 4 o'clock in the morning getting in that black hearse and looking in my rearview mirror and seeing a line of 25 trucks following us out. We went into town. Our daughter lived in town, and we went to her house and were able to take showers and get cleaned up a little bit and lay down. And Susan could go to sleep. I managed to sleep for about an hour. And Susan came in and she said, you need to go to the farm. I said, why? And she goes, you just need to go up there. So I said, okay. So I borrowed my daughter's car. My truck was destroyed, and Susan's car was destroyed. And so we drove back up to our place. When we got there, there were probably 150 people with chainsaws and boxes and bags. And in a tornado like that, stuff is blown everywhere, you know, and part of the cleanup process is just locating stuff. And we found tons of our neighbors' items on our property, and a bunch of our stuff was found in other places up to a half a mile away. But the outpouring of strangers and friends was astounding. And they were chainsawing, and I saw at least 6 tractors there. People were coming and doing all sorts of things to help clean up. And when you lose 1,000 trees, there's a lot of cleanup. And it was pretty amazing to see that kind of outpouring of support. And that went on for about a week and a half, and then it dwindled down, which was expected. And a couple of the big equipment companies had loaned me some like tractors for bulldozer and trackhoe and stuff like that. And so I was out there cleaning by myself quite a few days. And I remember it was about 4 weeks in, and I was driving out there all by myself for the afternoon. I'd work during the day and I'd go out there in the evening. And by this time we had rented a house in town and had a place to stay. And as I was driving, it was like a 2x4 hit me in the side of the head. God was on a break that night. He missed it. He just flat outright missed it. And then I thought, that's the stupidest thing I've ever thought in my life. He didn't miss it. And as a good Baptist boy, I'd been taught that God was omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, sovereign. And as I thought more and more, I realized that if he had just moved that tornado 75 feet to the south, we would have been fine. Or if he would have given me a 3-minute warning, I could have gotten outside, gotten in my truck, gotten away, or even just walked away. But we were exactly in the center of the destruction. And as I thought about it for the next 15 or 20 minutes, I came to a conclusion. God killed my son. And I thought about that for hours. And I couldn't shake it. And the next morning I saw a good friend of mine and I said, you know what? God killed my son. He said, no, God doesn't kill children. And I said, yeah, he does. And he's going to kill you. He's going to kill me. And he's going to do it in his own perfect way, in his own perfect timing. And I started to grasp what sovereignty was firsthand. It wasn't words anymore. It was reality. And as I started to contemplate the repercussions of believing that God is in control of everything. When those 19 men flew those planes into those towers in New York City and crashed that plane near here, God could have stopped it. Easy. But he didn't. So if he didn't, then he endorsed it. He knew every one of those men was going to do what they're going to do. He arranged for every one of their grandparents and great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents to be born in the last 200 years. He knew exactly what they were going to do on that day. And just the simple altercation of letting someone meet could have changed the whole culture and the whole thing. But he was in control of every iota of it. And so as I began to really sense this truth of God's sovereignty in all things, I started thinking about this hell issue. And boy, that just, all of a sudden I realized people don't go to hell because they chose to go to hell, like my pastor had told me for years and years. They go to hell because God put them in a lifestyle and a life place and set them up. And so it became apparent to me that either God was a monster or my comprehension of hell is skewed. Miraculously, God took me to a website called Tent Maker, Gary Emerald's website. And the very first verse that I read was 1 Timothy 4:10. Well, I never heard that from a pulpit in a Baptist church. And when I read that verse, it shook me theologically about this whole concept of salvation by decisional regeneration is what I call it. You get saved by making the magic decision. And as I began to investigate this more and more and read Gary's website and talk to people, I realized that this hell idea was a complete bogus idea. And it was part of church and not part of God's true word. And as I changed my whole paradigm, it rocked every aspect of my life. And I went to a Bible church for 31 years, and when they started getting wind that I was not a 5-point Calvinist that believed in hell, but I was a 5-point Calvinist that believed that God was going to save everybody, which, believe it or not, that works. And they came to me and told me that I wasn't welcome any longer, or I was going to have to stay really quiet. And I told them I can't unsee what I've seen. And before they did the formal excommunication, I asked them if I could visit with the pastor. And by the way, brethren churches do a formal excommunication. It's quite formal, and it's intense. But I asked if I could visit with the pastor once a week for an hour and hash this thing out. And the elders asked the pastor if that was okay, and he said, sure, let's do it. Well, it was quite enlightening for both of us, and especially for him, I gotta say. But that went on for, I think the elders thought it was going to go on for about 4 or 5 weeks, but it went on for 76 weeks. As I began to grow, I think you'd say, in this new paradigm that I'd entered, I came up with an acronym for something that I started to see. I call it PRA, and it's post-resurrection amazement. And I began to see that when we're all resurrected, including Jeffrey Dahmer, Joseph Stalin, even Billy Graham, when we're resurrected, first thing is we're going to be blown away by the fact that we've been dead and now we're alive. I think that's going to be astounding enough. But I think that there's probably going to be a sense of presence of our Lord and Savior. And what a beautiful sight it would be to see his nail-scarred hands reaching out for us. But I don't know how it's all going to fit, but I know that we're going to be amazed.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that amazement is what changes hearts. God's love and his mercy changes hearts, not discipline and fear of hell.
Right.
So, and I wrote about that, this little booklet here. It's a real long read. It's the fallacy of postmortem punishment. But there's some things about that particular subject that are in there. And one of the things, too, I began to realize was that all the denominations, all the atheists, and all the false religions, we call them, are perfect. Boy, that would make another Baptist mad. And I can talk about Baptists because I was Baptist. In fact, I asked the pastor at McKinney Bible Church, where I was going through the 76 weeks of research and study together. I said, who wrote the Quran? His first answer was, God. I said, amen. He knows what he's doing. But he's preparing all those people for their amazing day of resurrection. And it doesn't involve our idea of what's a perfect life. And there's been a lot of crazy lives on this planet, and a lot of really cruel, mean, horrible things have happened or are happening today that I can't even comprehend. I mean, it's just hard to imagine that our God is the designer of those things. But He knows exactly what He's doing.
He does.
As I deal too with some of the pastors and past church members, I usually like to ask them, at what point in the Garden of Eden was God surprised? I mean, when I started really realizing free will, and people say, well, Adam had free will. Yeah, he did have free will. He was a little bit set up. I mean, who gave him his propensity? His creator. Who put him in the garden? His creator. Who gave him Eve? Who gave him the rules? Who put the trees there? God did it all. So we're blaming all of this on Adam? I don't think so. God was never surprised. It was perfect. And by the way, do you know how to know if you're in the will of God? I mean, as a Baptist kid, that was number one rule. You got to figure out how to get in the will of God.
Right.
Got an answer?
No, I'm just
Just stretch. Well,
If you're
uh-huh.
breathing, you're aware you're alive.
Huh?
You're aware that you are alive.
Well, my answer is look around, because you're right smack dab in the middle of it.
Sure.
That you're in the middle of God's will.
Oh, yeah. Right.
Everybody is.
Yeah.
Those guys on death row, they're perfectly in God's plan. It sucks.
Temporary.
Yeah, that's right. And you know, as I contemplate too the different aspects of all of this, I think too about, Clyde was talking about good movies, and everybody here I assume is familiar with Les Miserables. Phenomenal story, great story. There's some phenomenal scenes in that movie, or in that play, where, remember, the bishop puts they're bringing in Jean Valjean. The police are bringing him back to the bishop's home after he had stolen the silver from his home, and it even hit the bishop in his sleep to keep him from coming after him. And the next morning, the police bring Jean Valjean to the bishop's home to return the silver, and the bishop says, "No, I gave him that silver." And he says, "By the way, Jean, you forgot the candlesticks." And he gives him the silver candlesticks, were extremely expensive. And the police are like, "What?" You know, they couldn't believe it. They were blown away, but guess who else was blown away? Jean Valjean. And what happened to Jean Valjean after that moment? Do y'all recall? He completely changed. He became a great, great, great man. And it was the mercy that he experienced changed his heart. But the reason I was asking about if you'd seen Les Miserables is that, can you imagine going to a play and paying $40 to go in and sit down, and you sit down in the theater and it's a packed house and the lights come down and the curtains open and all the actors come out, their arms wrapped around each other, and they take a bow? Well, that sucks. Man, I want to see some story here. You know, I want to see some redemption after some frustration and some different issues that are going on with, you know, people trying to outdo somebody else. And I think that had the garden just stayed the garden, there would have never been a contrast for us to be able to see and understand and appreciate God's love and His redemption and His mercy. That contrast it's come up several times in the day. Contrast is critical. It's everything. And we can't comprehend God's forgiveness without it. I got two last things I want to say. Number one is the first disciple that I want to meet after the resurrection is Judas. He did exactly what he was designed to do. And he's been maligned for 2,000 years by the church, and he was the only person I know of in the Bible that died of a broken heart. And he did not commit suicide. That's a lie. Every indicator is that he fell from a roof and was impaled when he fell, and it most likely was from a broken heart. And I want to finish with this. What is the one thing in all of the Bible that we're told that God desires to do? Any answers? Any thoughts?
Well, I mean, to be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth.
It's close. He desires to display His mercy. That's profound. It's in Micah. He desires to display. That's the only thing we're told that He desires to do. To display His mercy. I think it's amazing. Well, thank y'all for listening. And here's some photos I'll leave up here if anybody wants to look at them. This is a picture of Colson. This is one of his pieces of art. He was quite an artist, and we knew he was a good artist. He had won Artist of the Year 2 years in a row at the high school. And after he died, we found at least 30 or 40 of his pieces of art that were at the school. The teachers kept finding them. Wow. And they called us all summer long. We said, we found another one. And this is him in the white shirt with his big brother, Nathaniel.
He was 14.
He was 14 at the time. And this was the house before the tornado. We got a, believe it or not, that's snow. It snowed there that year, which doesn't do very often down there. And this was the house after. That's the same position that other picture is from. We found a 350 V8 engine embedded in a tree next to the house. We don't know where it came
Oh
from.
my goodness.
I have no idea. We have a dumpster on the property, still there, that we checked the serial number on it. We called the dumpster company. It came from 12 miles away. Here's the marker at the cemetery. It took us several years to find this stone, and we put it up, and it has a picture of him on it. But I had it engraved with his name, of course, and it says here, "The same God who ordained with precision the tornado that destroyed our home on May the 9th, 2006, and took our precious son temporarily from us, He is the same God who gave you the eyes to read this stone. He is sovereign and mightily in control of the slightest and greatest events in your life. When you study His Word and come to know the beauty of His sovereignty, you will then be able to relax and glorify God in all your trust." That's there. And by the way, I don't believe in the sovereignty of God because of the Bible. I believe in the sovereignty of God because I saw a picture of a Hubble telescope photograph, and that's all it took. You know? And if you look at some super microscope images and some super telescope images, I mean, our creators.
He's large and in
Phenomenal.
charge.
And this is one of Colson's sketches. This thing's about 24 inches tall. It's about that big. And it's from the Band of Brothers. And he had just read the Band of Brothers and he drew this up. It's a paratrooper from World War II. But interestingly, he put his grandfather's face on the image. And then this is just another one of him just hanging out. So just wanted to share those with you. Thank you. Yeah, about a week after Colson died, I got a phone call from the high school, and they said there was a letter up there that had been left for me by a gentleman who was actually visiting the school as a speaker to the sports conference a few days before that. So I went up to the school and picked it up as a handwritten letter, and this gentleman from Shreveport, Louisiana, his 20-year-old son had been killed in a one-car accident. He was a football player at University of Texas, and he was on his way to school at 5 o'clock in the morning and fell asleep and hit a tree. And in this letter, he told me, he said, whatever you do, don't ever try to get over your grief. Treasure your grief every day. He said, your grief is the proof from God that you miss your child. And he said, he told me, he called me actually shortly after we chatted, and he said, the day I fear the most is the morning I don't cry for my son. And so if you ever know anybody, or if you're ever personally going through, which we all will, grief, don't buy into this Christian counselor bullcrap about getting over your grief. Treasure it. So that's
All
what
right.
I'm saying.
All right.